Mr. Speaker.
I call Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to begin by joining those who have acknowledged Ngāti Paro's loss, and there are certainly some leaders in this country who will not and cannot be replaced, and Uncle Api was one of those people. I also want to welcome you back to the chair, Mr. Speaker. You could be forgiven, though, for feeling like you never left, especially listening to the Prime Minister's statement at the beginning of the sitting of this Parliament. He started with a motion of confidence, as is the practice in this House, a motion of confidence in his government. He claimed, Mr. Speaker, that his government was working for New Zealand. And I decided to listen quite keenly to what evidence the Prime Minister had to back up that statement that his government was indeed working for New Zealand. The first thing that he mentioned then in his speech was around, amongst the poor taste jokes, was around job creation. This notion that this has been a government that is somehow focused on creating employment. But just because you say it, Mr. Speaker, doesn't make it true. Of course, no one is denying that there have been new jobs created in New Zealand. Of course there have been. Every time a new startup employs a new individual, yes, 80,000 new jobs. But Mr. Smith, how many jobs have been lost? How many jobs have been lost? How many unemployed individuals are there as a result? Because I think we need to correct your figure. There are 46,000 more New Zealanders unemployed today compared to when that government came into office. 46,000 more New Zealanders unemployed. And surely that is the number that matters. That is a number that represents individuals who find themselves seeking employment but cannot get into work and have been in that situation as a result of lax policies around job creation. In just the last quarter, the number of Kiwis out of work grew by 8,000. And the thing that is most devastating about those numbers is, as Andrew Little pointed out in his State of the Nation speech at the beginning of the year, it doesn't have to be that way. If you make employment, job creation and work a focus of your government, it doesn't have to be that way. The last Labour government, for instance, maintained unemployment levels at 4% or lower for 4 straight years from 2004 into 2008. We had the lowest unemployment in the OECD. Today, we are 10th. In amongst all of the other countries, Mr. Smith, that have experienced the same global financial crisis, we are 10th. That is not something to be proud of. But we personally believe that we can be the lowest again if we focus on job creation. So it's not just about the jobs we create, though. It's also about the jobs that we hang on to. And there are a number of jobs in sectors like manufacturing where we have had extraordinary job losses, and it didn't need to be that way. If we work with business, if we work with unions, if we work with entrepreneurs, then it is possible to make that, to attain the goal that we are aspiring to as a Labour Party. But we've put a particular focus on small business, and for good reason, Mr. Speaker. 41% of new jobs are coming from that sector. It's an incredibly important sector in the business community, and yet we have had a tendency to pay mere lip service to the issues that are quite unique to that sector of the business community. IRD are particularly focused, for instance, on consulting with larger corporates when their needs and their way of doing business is entirely different to the SME community. That's just an example of how we could be making sure that we tailor our response to not only policy but basic day-to-day filing of forms. Our interaction with government could be improved enormously if we just listen directly to that sector. But there are some new challenges that we need to focus on as well. What are we doing to support businesses that have actually, not startups, but have been here 10 years or more, want to go to the next level, but don't even have the time or the energy to ensure that they have the capacity to do that? What are we doing about them? What are we doing about the baby boomers businesses who haven't had the time to even form a succession plan, and when they leave their business goes. What are we doing about them? There are so many opportunities that we just need to tap into, and that is what Labor will be focused on over the next few years. Mr. Speaker, the second piece of evidence that I heard from John Key, apparently that this government is working for New Zealand, were the mystery higher incomes that everyone is meant to be experiencing. Notice that he always refers to on average when he uses that statistic. My one simple question is, higher incomes for whom, Mr. Speaker? For whom? Because if, for instance, your income is outstripped by the cost of living and your ability to put a roof over your head, does it count? Well, for the average New Zealander, they certainly don't feel better off. And particularly that is exacerbated by the housing situation in Auckland in particular. And there is no denying it. My challenge to Mr. Key, and actually all of the National Party, is to take 5, maybe 10 young people aged between, say, 20 and 35 and ask them how they feel about housing in this country. Ask them about the prospect that they have of owning their own home, how daunted they feel about the possibility of them ever entering into the property market, and how that threatens their financial security for the rest of their lives. This is not something being bet up by the opposition. If that side of the House were talking to those young people, they would know that it is genuinely, in their minds, an absolute crisis. And how could the response, how could a real, genuine response from that government be to simply sell state houses? Now, this is something I also don't understand. State housing is one of the biggest issues that I have people coming into my office about, one of the most significant. There simply aren't enough houses. I would really like to hear, genuinely, hand on heart, National Party members tell me that the lack of state housing in their area isn't an issue. And if they genuinely believe that it is an issue, how is selling these houses going to improve the situation? I would wager that there are many members over on that side of the House that have as many qualms about this policy as we do. But Mr. Speaker, it wasn't just the tragedy of housing for those who are most vulnerable and for my entire generation and those who are yet to come into the housing market who are suffering under the lack of action from this government. There were the other bits of evidence that the Prime Minister rattled off in his speech that somehow was meant to convince us that this government is working for them, and ISIS, international issues, was one of them. Now, Mr. Speaker, I take great offence at the implication from the Prime Minister in his speech that by challenging his plan, that somehow we don't care about human rights. We cannot shut down debate on a question of whether or not we send our troops into conflict and to face dire consequences like death in the battlefield just because the Prime Minister thinks that by raising the debate, we don't care about human rights. That is insulting. That is insulting. Of course we care. The issue is not whether ISIS is brutal. That is not in question. Of course they are. The question is not whether or not the international community should react. Of course we should. The question is, what is the most effective course of action? That is the debate that we are under obligation to put before that government, and they are yet to satisfy that question. What is the most effective course of action? It is insulting, Mr. Smith, that you think that by challenging the grounds on which you are putting the explanation, the evidence under which you propose putting our troops into battle, that we somehow don't care about human rights. That is absolutely insulting. Finally, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister mentioned that under the banner of helping children in poverty and vulnerable families, something we've been waiting 6 years to hear more from the government on, the government is finally, quote, looking at ways to help families and children in material hardship. Mr. Speaker, material hardship is one of only 5 measures of poverty. It's one of 5. He's clearly used the words material hardship on purpose. If he were genuinely interested in looking at the poverty children are living in, he wouldn't exclude income poverty. That is where this crucial debate lies, and until we address that, we will not address the hardship our families are living in. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister may claim that National is working for New Zealand, but for which ones? House buyers, those on zero-hour contracts, children without enough to get by, families working hard but going nowhere? Any government who genuinely wanted to work on behalf of all New Zealanders should be doing something about them.
Call the Honourable Amy Adams.